the company was very small then, and I hung in there for just a couple of weeks, and I got the lay of the land, and I went to him after 2 weeks, and I said, Russell, look, you're managing all these artists. You've got a number of artists recording for a variety of labels. You've just launched this label called Def Jam. I started working there in June of 1984. It's before the very first Def Jam singles came out in the fall of 1984.
Yeah.
I said, I tell you what, you've got all this stuff going on. You do not have a publicist. Let me be your publicist. Russell shrugged and said, sure, go ahead. That's what happened. Now, here's what I told myself, because I'd never been a publicist. I said, Bill, you can do better than nothing, because Russ had no publicist. He had nothing going on under the banner of publicity. So I said to myself, I can do better than nothing. And that was the start of it.
You're listening to the New York
Said podcast.
Fear not, my friends. This will be my greatest performance.
Give it to me.
Here we go. We came, we saw, we kicked its ass.
Shall we?
Let's do it. I've been in your world for the last 72 hours. I've watched your films, bits and pieces, because I didn't know that this was happening until fairly recently. Yeah. And shout out to Jeanette, because she made the connection. But at that point...
My sis.
She's your sister?
Love.
I remember watching an interview that you did like in 92, and you were saying, Jeanette, your photography would make a great book. Had there been any other books similar to what we see now, where everybody who's a photographer has a book coming out before you done that, especially in the hip hop realm?
I think Jeanette was a pioneer. And I think that the book that we put out in 91, I'm pretty sure, was also pioneering. It was among the first of photo books devoted to hip hop. Yeah, by that time I'd known her for half a dozen years or more, and I'd admired her work, and I'd hired her to take pictures of some of the Def Jam artists, with whom I was working. And it just seemed like kind of an obvious thing to do. She's English, and she'd come from England before coming to America, and she had a writer friend, a music critic in England, and screw me, I can't remember his name right now, that he might have suggested to Jeanette, you need to put out a photo book, whatever.
Right.
Let's say that that's what happened. Yeah. And then JB says to him, well, would you write the foreword or something? And he declined to do it. And so I jumped in and I said I would do it.
Has your writing always been so quirky? I found the book on the Internet Archive, and I just began flipping through it, and I saw
Which, the Run DMC book or Jeanette's book?
The one you did with Rap.
That's Jeanette.
Yeah, but it's your writing as well.
Yeah.
And so the piece you did with, say, Just Ice, for example, it was really pithy in the sense of you captured him in one paragraph, where at the time he might have been going through some trouble with the law, what have you. But then you quoted him to basically say he was saying something to the extent of women go crazy over me because of my picture on the album cover, and all they want to do is have sex with me. And he's like, I don't want to do that because all you do is lose weight. And then you ended it something to the extent of last we saw, he weighs 130 pounds.
That's real funny. Did I say that? Are you sure that's me?
Yes, you.
I like it.
So, but you've done this in quite a bit of your writing. Even the essay you did in Vicky Toback's book, Contact High, you talked about at the very beginning, you're I was taking my yearbook picture. Do you remember that story?
Yeah, sure.
Can you tell that story?
It's a story that kind of allows me to talk about, my lifelong interest in photography and in my interest in the relationship between the photographer and his or her subject. For the purpose of the essay for Contact High, I started with a memory. It occurred in the fall of '68. I was 16 years old, just before we started my senior year in high school. They took photos of us all for our class yearbook, which would be published in the spring of the year, the next year. I sat down for a photo. I don't know if I'd been the subject of a formal portrait very many times in my life up until then. And, I wasn't frozen with anxiety about it, but I was probably a little nervous. And the photographer said to me, okay, listen, we're getting ready to go. I'm going to tell you when, as I think about it now, he probably didn't advise me in advance of this, but he pointed his camera at me and he said, "Say sex." And I went, my face exploded in a big smile. And that's the photo that's in my yearbook.
Yeah.
Is my very happy look at having to pronounce the word sex at a time when I hadn't had any, and I was excited at the prospect of it. I told that story as a measure of, as I said, kind of my ongoing lifelong interest in photography.
But then from there, you folded in just the history and the technology of contact sheets in general. Another part where it was just like, I wonder if Matthew Brady, when he photographed Abraham Lincoln. And so as I'm reading that, I'm like, I had no idea. I know the iconic photograph, but I had no idea it was attached to a photographer with a name. And the same photographer took the picture of Frederick Douglass and many others.
Sure.
And then from there, you went into this really cool story about Charles Harris.
Teenie Harris.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, he's a remarkable guy. I collect books. One of my ongoing interests is photography, and particularly black photography, or folks who concentrate on black culture and the black community, which is just kind of an outgrowth. Everything is an outgrowth of my love of music, and in particular music that originated in the black community. The start for me was listening to jazz, listening to R&B and soul music and funk and the rest of it, and being content with the music itself. And then my interest extended a little bit. Well, so I love this song. Who's the artist? What's his name? Yep. So then I would dig into the biographies of these individual creators. I mean, this is all kind of a natural progression, I would think, for most folks, is after educating myself or beginning to educate myself about the individual who made the music, well, then I want to know more about his life. Where did he come from? What was the community like? And on and on. I'm interested in music and then biography and also photography. With all of that said, I heard about this guy, Charles Harris, known as Teenie Harris. He was out of Pittsburgh, and I think he spent his whole career in Pittsburgh. And he was called Teenie because, in fact, he was short of stature, although I think he was a talented basketball player in high school, even though he was short. But he had a second nickname, I discovered, which was One Shot, Charles One Shot Harris. And that's because he claimed, most of his stuff he shot on assignment for, was it maybe the Pittsburgh Courier? It was a local black newspaper out of Pittsburgh. He'd go on assignment to shoot something, and he'd kind of suss it out. The story he told us that he would suss it out on the spot and shoot a single frame and capture exactly what he wanted to capture and then go bring it back to the paper. And you know what? I love that story. Yeah. I'm dubious about it. I'm skeptical of it because I really do think that, Vicki was onto something. For her to concentrate on contact sheets is a way of laying bare the process, the conventional process of photography. Young people, this goes back to a time before digital media. Photographs were shot on film, and after the photos were shot and the subject had gone away, the photographer would print out a contact sheet of the individual shots, of the negatives he'd shot, and make a choice about which was the best image and print that. That describes the process itself. Teenie Harris, One Shot Harris, claimed to throw out that process. Now, he didn't need it.
Right.
He would essentially edit spontaneously on the spot and make a brilliant decision and shoot a magnificent photo, and then his work for the day was done. He could walk the fuck off. He became very highly regarded, and when it came time for him to explain how he did what he did, that was his explanation.
Yeah. You wrote another essay, In Total Chaos, with Jeff Chang.
Yeah.
And in that essay, where you really break down like this history of photography, and one of the things that stood out to me.
You're killing me. You actually read all these things?
Yeah. Why would I come here and waste your time?
All right, well.
I didn't want to freestyle it.
No, very good.
Yeah, but I genuinely want to know. And the thing about you is just like the things that you're you're doing, I'm already interested in. So these are things that I had no idea existed,
Okay.
but now I have a reason to like dive in.
Okay.
Even though I've had conversations with many of the photographers that are in the essay,
Yeah.
thankfully,
Yeah.
I did not see, you pointed out something in the sense of, Martha Cooper, Henry Chalfant, they were coming from the outside capturing the culture,
Right.
which I never thought about because I grouped them all together. Sure. Like they're part of the culture because they were the photographers there. But then the way you broke it down was like Martha captured them in action.
Yeah.
She had shots of Dondi and all the rest of the guys, and I mean, it's there. But then going from where Jeanette took the baton, where she began to like focus on the actual person and not so much.
Yeah.
Can you talk more about that? Because I feel like I'm not articulating it as clear as you did in that essay. You don't have to like summarize it, but that philosophy that you were writing about.
Really, as I recall, the thrust of that article was just, it was kind of a history of photographers' involvement with hip hop. And one of the things that struck me was kind of how early on very good photographers, whether or not they'd come up in, a hip hop identified community, began to document this new art form and this new culture. And it really, really made a huge difference in terms of presenting the culture to folks beyond the culture at a time when, a lot of, the communities themselves were kind of obscure to the extent that rap emerged from, or hip hop emerged from, the outer boroughs in communities of color. All of those folks were, sidelined or just, kind of beyond commentary and beyond interest. During the 70s, when hip hop was being born in those communities, pop culture mostly was focused, certainly in New York City, it was focused on Manhattan and Club 54 and the disco scene. And really, I think that probably was a boon to these young folks of color in the outer communities. They didn't have to worry about being overseen by, the guardians of culture, the pillars of culture. They could just do exactly what the fuck they wanted, and entertain themselves, and everything grew from there. But I'm saying one of the things that was really notable to me was the extent to which these early photographers started to capture the culture in its early years and helped to publicize what was going on and popularize what was going on. So that was the thrust of it. I'll also note, for what it's worth, I think I noted this in that essay also, was that most of the first half dozen years of hip hop, if we've just gone through what's purported to be the 50th anniversary of hip hop, and the birth date is the fall of 1973. Okay, let's accept it for the sake of discussion. There were almost no photographers working to document that, almost none. And also, guess what? None of these artists, at least on the musical side, were making recordings. And so very little survives in terms of documentary evidence about what the heck was going on. There were flyers, or a ton of flyers. And, have you ever talked to Pete Nice about his flyers collection?
I heard about that through Adler.
I'll put you on to Pete. And,
that'd be dope.
Yeah. And he'll, he's got a stupendous collection of flyers.
Incredible.
But it's a genre unto itself. It's not photography. It's not film. And
it's illustration.
Yeah.
A good amount of it.
Yeah. And Pete's right to have collected it, archived it, saved it. But I'm saying, photographers didn't really come onto the scene until very late in the 70s. Probably, as I think about it, just about at the same moment as the very first rap recordings emerged, which was, 1979. And I suppose it's no accident, that photographers began to get interested at that point, because as soon as these rappers began to make recordings, well, the insulation of the culture went up in smoke. The stuff became pop culture right away. That's a pop medium. Yeah. It's a record.
It went from exclusive to inclusive. Before, you had to be like, because it was all word of mouth, you had to know where to go and all those things. But now it becomes this popular thing. And if it's going to be popular, that means it's going to pop up in some place close to you, whether it's like, okay, now we were doing it in the Bronx, now we're going to do it over here in Manhattan, we're going to do it in Queens, we're going to do it around the world, over 50 years.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. I mean, along those lines, I probably mentioned a photo shot by a photographer who called himself Butch Green at the time and then changed his name, and he was known as Talib Haq. He was from Hollis, like Run DMC, and he shot the cover photo for Run DMC's first album, which came out in 1984. And the music on that album was absolutely groundbreaking. It was radical, formally, but it was very, very popular also. I mean, that's, Run DMC's astonishing achievement is that one and the same time, they could be, radical exponents of this brand new art form and kill with it.
Yeah.
Hugely popular from the very beginning.
Resonated. In that new doc that just dropped, DMC says, like, when you saw us, you saw you.
Right. And the cover photo that was shot by Butch, it's a visual reinforcement of what the music did. Okay, because they were dressed, the rappers who had preceded them were dressing in styles that were kind of holdovers from
Parliament,
the 70s.
Yeah.
It's Parliament, it's Michael Jackson, it's, they're all going to present themselves as brothers from another planet.
Yes.
That kind of thing. Yeah. And Runnin' D and J wore, fairly typical street gear. Not to say that, within that genre, it wasn't stylish as hell. It was, but it wasn't fantastical. It was, more or less everyday gear, good-looking everyday gear. With that said, people who bought the album and saw that photo, it helped them to identify with Run DMC. It's not to say that, you couldn't take a look at the guys from Parliament or Michael Jackson and the rappers who adopted their style. You couldn't look at them and be aspirational.
Right.
That the fantastical way that these guys presented themselves was also inspirational. But Run DMC, as DMC himself said, presented themselves as everyday guys from the hood.
Yeah.
And they were, and it wasn't just the music, it was the photography that helped get that argument across.
And it was crazy because I grew up on American Linden. I remember seeing DMC once when I was in high school. He was in his Jeep. And I was like, hey, and he was like, hey, and then he just pulled off. But he was just by himself in his Jeep. It wasn't like, I'm not talking to this kid. It was just like, hey, what up, what up? And they just kept it pushing. One of the other things I liked in that article was that comparison of Ricky Powell and Glennie Friedman, where they're like the odd couple in their styles of what Ricky was able to pull out of history in the making and what Glenn was able to. Could you touch on that?
Yeah, I mean, it speaks to kind of the breadth of choices that a given photographer can make. And these guys had very distant styles. Glenn is still walking the earth. Ricky has left us. And Glenn, he's a great photographer. Glenn is a guy who's, very, very clear about the setting and the quality of the prints that he makes and overseeing. He just has a very clear idea in advance about what he wants to do and where he wants to do it. And he's going to make superb black and white prints of his work. And by contrast, Ricky, he did not care about making decent prints of his work. Ricky was a fan of candid photography. And so, in effect, he would shoot from the hip often. And he didn't need his subjects to pose. And that defined him. And, he was more or less openly contemptuous of photographic technology. What he used to say was, he says, photography is easy. All you need is a PhD. PhD? What are you talking about, Rick? Push here, dummy.
That's it.
That's what Rick said. That's what he used to say.
And then in contrast to Jamel's style, which is, hey, how are you? Like, he shot zero candids in those days.
Right. Jamel was unique because he was really dedicated just to everyday folks and to black men in particular, I think.
And we're talking about Jamel Shabazz.
Yeah, Jamel Shabazz, exactly right. I don't know if he ever turned his camera on a performer of any kind. Jamel's subject has remained everyday people, people that you cannot identify. They're not famous. And even so, those photos, sure enough, are beguiling.
I read the very first chapter of your book.
Which one? The Run DMC book?
Yes. I was trying to remember the title of it, but it was something to the extent of like...
Tougher Than Leather.
No. That chapter. It was
I
like
see.
Nights of War, Days of Peace was the title of the chapter.
Yeah.
And in it, you paint this fantastic picture of gangs happening and gang warfare happening right before a performance in LA during one of Run DMC shooting. Like, you take us inside of this riot essentially where several people were hurt, and then, you know, them getting ready just in case somebody comes into the green room, and then going to the radio station the next day. Were you present for that? It felt like you were there in the theater, and you had a video camera, and you were just transcribing what had happened.
What are you, my best friend?
What does that mean?
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay.
As I recall, I had two things going for me. I could talk to Run and D,
Yep.
who certainly were there, and probably Jay. I had a pretty thick file of press accounts about what had transpired. Believe me, it made news, especially in the LA papers. And so, I synthesized that, and I, added, Run and D's perspective, and I just wrote the best I could. That's all.
Knowing that you wrote that in '87 and it was re-released in
2022. Oh, 2002. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you watch all the documentaries that come out, say the one that just came out, how accurate is it to what you wrote when you were there, firsthand, secondhand, when you're seeing, because sometimes documentaries can have a bias or a spin. Do you ever see that difference between what you've written and how history can change over a number of years?
Well, I had my own bias too. I love these guys, and, I wrote the book, in effect, in praise of them and their achievements. I don't deny that. I mean, one of the reviews I got from an English critic was, I can't remember exactly, what incident, he focused on, some mess that Run DMC got into, and, I hadn't mentioned it. And, what's wrong with you, Bill? He addressed me by name in his review. Why didn't you go after this, Bill? That was his way of saying, I was biased too, and I wasn't going to write about anything that was terribly negative. Having said that, I just did the best I could. Certainly I took advantage of the fact I was leaning into, having worked with these guys for years at that point and secured their trust, having held on to so many news accounts of what happened and what all they did as they did it. And so that helped. In terms of, my opinion of documentaries, it's like anything else. Some of them are wonderful and some of them are not so wonderful. I've got my opinions. I mean, vis-a-vis this new 3-part documentary about Run DMC called Kings from Queens, I think they do a very, very good job. And not least because, they have access to Run and D, to Russell and Leor, and they have footage of Rick Rubin, various of Run DMC's friends who from the hood who aren't better known but have something smart to say. They lean on these first-person accounts of what happened as it happened. You'd want to believe that that's pretty standard, documentary style, but a decent proportion of documentarians don't manage really to capture the subject the way that even they might want to. And, I accept it. I've got a critical sensibility, and I'm going to assess every recording, every movie, on and on, every meal that I eat. This I like, this I don't like so much. Here's why I love it, here's why I don't. So, I do have an enduring interest in documentaries, and, as I think about it, I may be more attracted to docs than to, feature films. Not always,
right?
But, sometimes feature films just strike me as unbelievable,
right,
and corny in a way that documentaries don't.
You have amassed so many collections and archives to the point that you've donated them. Yeah. So like the underground comics that you've donated to RISD, the cool thing is that they scan and give you a sample of, like, you can click on it. And
isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, that's fantastic, where you can like, oh, that's what a Zap comic is. And I love Crumb's work, even some of his darker stuff. But to see it, like these things that I've heard about it, but never seen it. And then, what you've donated to Cornell and the...
Sold it.
Oh, you sold it?
I sold it to Cornell.
Oh, excuse me.
And I sold it to the Smithsonian.
Oh,
I sold
did?
it another collection, yeah.
Yes. So, the thing that came to mind, I was like, that's it out. I mean, I went looking through, like, why I saw the photography from, the iJammy gallery and all that. But I was like, if he sold that or he donated this, what did you keep? What are the things that you were like, I can't donate this. I can't keep that.
I'll tell you.
Okay.
I've got an answer. And that is, vis-a-vis photography in particular. Well, I'll say two things. The photos that I've held on to that I haven't made part of any of the collections that I've since given away or sold are photos of myself during the course of my career. And even so, that might end up going bye-bye. I'm talking now to a museum about their interest in my so-called personal papers. And as part of my papers, I would make this collection of photos of my various exploits in the music business part of it. So that would go bye-bye finally. Your listeners won't be able to see my collection of records.
Before we go on, because I know I'm just with this right now. You have so many records over there, it's crazy. But I read on the one LP that your favorite record was Kind of Blue. I got here like an hour early because I just don't like to be late. Okay. I was listening to it.
You'd never heard it before?
No, of course I've heard it.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
But it's been a minute since I've revisited it. Sure. It was the first CD I bought in undergrad. I used to be very angry, and it would relax the shit out of me.
Oh, good for you.
Like, I would just start painting these weird abstract paintings. I remember trying to give one away. They was like, there's too much anger in that painting. I'm good. But the CD itself would just take me away. And so as, today it's rainy. I'm sitting in the coffee cafe variety. I'm looking out the window. It felt like a poem that I was sitting in a cinematic film as I'm listening to this album,
That's the soundtrack.
Yeah, but I started thinking, I was like, I'm listening to all blues on repeat at this point now. But I realized that it's Miles Davis, Coltrane, Bill Evans, Cannonball. And I'm like, it's like a Marvel superhero of jazz musicians coming together to create this extraordinary piece. And if you said, okay, which one is Cannonball and which one is Coltrane, I couldn't tell you. Mm-hmm. But I'm not even there for that. I'm there to just be swept away. So for you, what was the impact of that album?
It's just deeply beautiful from, second to second over the course of two sides of a record or, whatever it is. In CD form, it would be, 45 minutes or so, 50 minutes. I'm certainly not the first or only person to feel that way about it. It's beyond a classic. It's bigger than genre. It happens to be, to the extent that people are forced to make a decision, what's my favorite album? Right. Many folks will name it. So I'm just part of that crew. Now, I happen to have been, I think I was still in high school when I encountered it, and it swept me away. I went to Detroit public schools. I was born in Brooklyn, but grew up in Detroit. And in the fifth grade, they said that, they would teach us how to play the instrument of our choice, and we could be in the band. And, I went home and this was interesting to me, and I said to my mom, I said, well, what instrument should I play? And she said, trombone. I said, okay. But, she grew up, listening to Tommy Dorsey and Glenn Miller.
Yeah.
Right?
Big band.
Yeah, and that didn't mean so much to me, but I decided I would play trombone. And that led me, among others, to J.J. Johnson, who's the king trombonist of all time, I think. And I began subscribing to Downbeat magazine, while I'm still in high school. And, reading, about these artists and the records they made, put me onto the recordings as well. And so I began to educate myself. And it wasn't hard for me to connect with this stuff.
Right.
It so happened that it was a very, very rich time for music when I was growing up. It's called the 1960s. There was never, I was never just siloed. It was, walled off from listening to whatever the hell I liked. And
the
also,
Beatles and, yeah.
Take the Beatles, for example, okay? The Beatles were a bunch of kids from fucking Liverpool, working class Liverpool. They fell in love with American R&B, but not just R&B. And so if you go back and listen to their early albums and listen to their covers, they're going to cover Little Richard and Chuck Berry, but they're also going to cover Carl Perkins and Buck Owens. And I didn't know about any of those artists as a 13-year-old, a 12-year-old.
Wow.
certainly by the time I got out of high school, I could start investigating and immersing myself in their music. And that's just happened. That's the story of my life right there. It's what I understand about culture more broadly. And this is some hippie shit.
Go for it.
Okay, ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
One thing leads to another. Everything's connected. So I'm going to go wherever the music takes me.
So right here, this is where I asked you about your pivot from writing and freelancing and from the daily news into your tenure at Def Jam.
Yeah.
How did that happen? Because it seems like at one point you're like so much older than everyone you're around, and you've had this extensive life prior that prepares you for your time at Def Jam. Can you just speak to that one thing after another?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a college dropout. I was accepted at the University of Michigan. I started there in the fall of 1969. I made it through 3 non-consecutive semesters. I dropped out. School wasn't engaging to me, but Ann Arbor was. That was a really culturally and politically rich place to be at that time. I stayed in Ann Arbor for 6.5 years, and I was able to immerse myself in music. I started working on the radio. I started writing about music. Was I trained as a DJ? No, I taught myself. Was I trained as a music journalist? No, I just started doing it for a hippie newspaper there, and they said, fine. And, finally I got tired of Ann Arbor, and I moved to Boston, and I got a job writing for the Boston Herald, and also I worked on the radio there briefly, WBCN. And then I got tired of Boston, and I moved back to New York, which is where I'd been born and which I'd never stopped loving. That's 1980. And I freelanced around, so I wrote for the Daily News, I wrote for the Village Voice, I wrote for People magazine, I wrote a couple of pieces for Rolling Stone, and over the course of 4 years, I never really did advance beyond what I was doing as a freelancer. I had a tryout at People magazine for a month. They ended up not hiring me. So, to the extent that I thought about it, I probably understood that somehow I just didn't have the goods necessary to be a full-time feature writer, let's say for Rolling Stone. Meanwhile, I had done a piece for People magazine it turned out to be about a nightclub in the Bronx called Disco Fever, which was absolutely central at that time in terms of the hip-hop scene. And it's in the Bronx, and it's obscure, and even so I was able to sell in the idea of the story to my friend, to an editor I knew at People magazine. So they let me write the story. And in the course of it, the original story wasn't going to be about Disco Fever. The idea that I had was much broader.
Right.
It's just, it's already 1982, late 1982, early 1983 when I pitch it. And to my way of thinking, having been following this hip hop thing right along, I'm saying this stuff is exploding.
Yep.
And so let me just write a story about this rap music thing. That was my pitch. And the guy said, oh, okay, go ahead, right? Then almost the very first thing I did is I just had this feeling, let me call Russell Simmons. And I hadn't even met Russ, but I'd heard about him when I did a story for about Curtis Blow for the Daily News in 1980.
Was that for the breaks or was that for?
It was pegged to the breaks.
Yep.
And, I interviewed Robert Ford, Rocky Ford, and his partner, JB, and they were his producers. And Rock told me about Kurt's manager, Russell Simmons. And I was still thinking of Russ when it was time for me to start researching this story about rap music at the time. And I had an astonishing evening with Russell. And he was promoting, among other things, he would promote records to nightclubs. And he was running around that night working on a record by Sweet G, who mostly was the nighttime MC at this nightclub called Disco Fever in the Bronx. But he put out a record, I think it was called Games Females Play. And Russ took me around from one nightclub to another. And it's all downtown and midtown. And he managed just to glide through the velvet rope every single place we went and walk right up to the DJ booth and get in this guy's ear, give him a copy of the record, and we'd split. we ended up doing what we needed to do downtown. And so at about 2 o'clock in the morning, we headed back to the Bronx. And we went to Disco Fever. And we hung out there until about 8 o'clock in the morning.
Jeez.
Well, it was basically an after-hours place. And, like everybody else, I did the drugs that were offered to me. That kept me up until morning. And when I hit the street to go back downtown, I knew that was going to be my story. I wasn't going to work from the general to the particular. I was going to work from the particular to the general. So focus on Disco Fever and let it stand for hip-hop culture at large. So that story appears in the spring, I think March of 1983. A year later, it's 1984. And Ronald Reagan is running for re-election. And I'm not a fan of Reagan. And I had an idea. I thought, well, I can write a rap, an anti-Reagan rap, and give it to Curtis Blow, because I knew Kurt didn't always write his own rhymes. So I'll give it to Kurt and he'll record it and we will rap Ronald Reagan out of office. That was my brilliant idea. And in order to sell it in, I had to talk to Russ. So I got in touch with Russ again. A year has gone by. And I think he took a look at the rhymes I wrote, and I guess he didn't care about them too much, but the two of us got into a conversation. And this long story, I'm going to finally tie up with a bow. He says to me, look, I can't believe, he flattered me into the job. He said, I can't believe a guy as smart as you doesn't have a job. Why don't you come work with me?
Wow.
And, had I ever done, worked for, an artist management company before? No. And did Russell have a particular idea about what I could do for him? No.
Wow.
But, the company was very small then, and I hung in there for just a couple of weeks, and I got the lay of the land, and I went to him after 2 weeks, and I said, Russell, look, you're managing all these artists. You've got a number of artists recording for a variety of labels. You've just launched this label called Def Jam. I started working there in June of 1984. It's before the very first Def Jam singles came out in the fall of 1984.
Yeah.
I said, I tell you what, you've got all this stuff going on. You do not have a publicist. Let me be your publicist. Russell shrugged and said, sure, go ahead. That's what happened.
Fantastic.
Now, here's what I told myself, because I'd never been a publicist. I said, Bill, you can do better than nothing, because Russ had no publicist. He had nothing going on under the banner of publicity. So I said to myself, I can do better than nothing. And that was the start of it.
That's fantastic.
You like that?
I love that. Actually, if I put the title as "You Can Do Better Than Nothing" with Bill Adler.
Go ahead. Don't call it "You Can do better than nothing." Call it "I Can Do Better Than Nothing," or whatever.
Yeah, I can do better than nothing with Bill Adler.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. We've collaborated just there.
I'm an editor too.
Yes. Man, we could talk for hours. Maybe I'll come back if you allow me to do a part 2. But through this journey, what has been one of the most important lessons that you've learned personally and professionally from the trombone to now?
The thing that I've learned, the thing that was crystallized for me during my hippie years was do the work you want to do. And at that time, that was fairly radical. That was some hippie shit because, I think of my parents who did well. They're born into working class families. They are themselves the children of immigrants. They lived through the Depression. They lived through the Second World War. They came out the other side. They started, their adult lives, and they achieved, middle class status. But the cost was kind of to adhere to a script. It was a pretty corny script. There was a record that came out by the OJs, 73 or so, called Living for the Weekend. Mm-hmm. And by that time, I really rejected that kind of thinking. That was very old-fashioned thinking.
Their thinking.
Yeah. Their thinking was, why do you have to live for the weekend? Because you're just trapped in a job you don't like all week long. So you live for the weekend. That's when you can liberate yourself, right? And by that time, I'd been a doggone hippie for 4 years, and the attitude struck me as terribly confining, terribly corny, and I wasn't going to live my life that way. And what was really the key thing then was two things. I certainly knew what I didn't like and what I didn't want to do.
Yes.
I was pretty sure, more and more I was coming to understand that what was central to my life was a love of music. And so to the extent that I could figure out a way to make a living one way or another, devoted to my love of music, that's what I was going to do. And that has defined my life.
Incredible. What you're saying is resonating with me even to today, where I've had an interesting storied life, but I found the thing that I love to do.
And you're doing it. You're incredible too.
Thank you.
I'll tell you one more thing. Let me give you one more punchline.
Give it to me.
Okay, ready?
Yeah.
Having made this decision about doing what I want to do, I told my parents I was dropping out of college. And they were very upset, understandably. And also, fairly understandably, they threatened me. Billy, if you drop out of school, we're not going to support you anymore. And I said, Mom, Dad, not a problem. You know why? Because I was working at a record store then, making a full $2 an hour. That's $80 a week.
Yeah.
In 1971, okay, and I'm living with a pal of mine. We're splitting the rent. My share monthly is $80. So I was good. I knew I could live on it, and I said, I'm done. I dropped out because I could support myself at that time. I was 19 years old.
There was a quote from Bill Cunningham, the photographer. He was like, if they don't pay you, they can't tell you what to do.
I don't want to make it seem like, that's the magical or the easy solution for anybody.
It's definitely the harder road, but it's free.
Well, real particularly, it speaks to the difference in the economy then and the economy now.
That's a good point.
I was able to live on $80 a month. That's 1971.
Right.
That's not a thing anymore.
And even the housing has changed and the cost of living, and I don't want to go too deep into that, but I do want to respect your time, and I want to say thank you.
Did you finish saying what you wanted to say about, how this reflects your own experience? Why don't you put that in there?
Oh, yeah, no. I mean, I've been an independent contractor since 2009. Sometimes I'm interviewing Michelin chefs for companies, or I might be interviewing an accordion player in Louisiana. I love
it. Good for you.
I love it.
Yeah.
But the consistency is nil. I don't have any consistency in my life. So You're
wrong.
Huh?
What's constant is your enthusiasm for the work you do, no matter who the individual is.
Yeah, agreed. Because I've been living as just kind of this free spirit, but I'm ready to settle down, and not settle down, but take root at a singular place and create more consistency. So now I'm all right, how do I get to the point where, I do work for an entity that just allows me to do the thing that I'm very passionate about, but I'm doing my best to attract it because, even how you get a job today has changed. But at the same time, what you said still resonates because I'm not driven by bread. I'm driven by the experience and the ability to capture.
This is really deep. To me, there's nothing more valuable than having a passion for some doggone thing.
Yeah.
And being able to follow your passion. It's certainly more valuable than money per se. And what I believe is, if you follow your passion, let's say if you follow your passion and you're willing to work hard, you will be able to make a living out of following your passion. And that is one of the two keys to happiness in life.
Yeah.
There's only two things in my little opinion. There's love and work. Okay? You want to do what you can to nail down your love life? I've been married for over 40 years to a woman I met in Ann Arbor. And I've done the work that I want to do forever. And so I can't complain about a goddamn thing.
Yeah. But that was what I was saying was you said the first thing you learned was what I don't want to do. And that's what set me off on this path. I was I thought I wanted to be a chef. Turns out I hate to cook. I found what I'm doing now, and I've been doing it for a number of, decades or what have you. So.
You win. You're winning. Don't you feel that? I feel that. I know you do.
I do feel it.
Yeah.
So I feel like I'm rambling.
Not at all.
Thank you for your time, Bill.
We're on the same page.
Excellent. But yeah, we're out of here. I'll talk to you soon.
All right, man.
All right, brother. Peace.
Peace.